And let me share my screen. And can you see the slides here?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Yeah, but we also see the note.
Now can you see the slide?
There we go. Good.
And I thought we were at the beginning. Sorry. So thank you all for joining us today, but even more importantly, thank you for your interest in taking action on climate change. That's great. And thank you for Carol and Christina for organizing this. And if you can mute your lines, that way we're not interrupted by dogs or phone calls. And if you put it on speaker view, up in the upper right, there should be a way to have speaker view so you can see the slides better. And if the idea is we've got about 30 minutes of Christina and I talking, and we'll have a few breaks after sections that we could have a few questions, and then we'll have most of the discussion at the end. But if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, and Christina or I will try to answer them while the other's talking, and then we'll bring them up at the appropriate times. So this is, we're going to break down my normal presentation and cover it in 3 different sessions. And so this is the first piece, and it has introduction to tell you where I'm coming from, talk a little bit about the PCUSA and our history on working on action on climate change, and then the climate science, the atmospheric science, and Christina's going to talk about the consequences in southern Indiana. And then in 2 weeks, we'll talk about the social sciences, economics, and the specific proposal that we are working on, type of carbon pricing. And we'll talk about why it's a faithful alternative. And then in the 3rd section, we'll talk more about action and what we can do and what you can do in southern Indiana. So to introduce myself a little bit, I do have a connection with southern Indiana because we lived there until I was 7 years old, and in Columbus. And we went to the Presbyterian church there, and I remember Bill Laws, meeting with him, talking about fishing, because that's what is important to a 6 or 7 year old. But my dad was active in the Presbyterian denomination and was a commissioner at a General Assembly years later. And Bill Laws was the moderator of the General Assembly for that General Assembly. So I'm an engineer, an executive with SO Exxon and ExxonMobil, and worked in the oil and gas industry, and am proud of what I contributed to the energy industry and what the energy industry has contributed to society with powering the Industrial Revolution. But there are consequences that we need to address that we're not addressing. And we also lived in Europe for a decade early in our career, and saw how the higher gasoline taxes there made us more efficient with energy use, including my wife and I, and was a fan of higher energy prices. So I wrote my first letter to the first President Bush saying we ought to have higher energy prices in the US. But since I worked for Exxon, a lot of my colleagues thought I was a little bit off the reservation. But 2 decades after that, Exxon started supporting revenue neutral carbon tax. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. In retirement, I wanted to advocate more for carbon pricing. And I found that PCUSA was active on climate issues with the divestment movement. So that's the way our paths crossed, and I got involved in the Presbyterian climate activities. And PCUSA has been advocating for decades that we need to take action on climate change. They were, I think, relatively early on aware that this was an issue and that we should be acting on it. And over a decade ago, the General Assembly called for pricing of greenhouse gases, which is exactly what we're talking about. And then divestment has been an issue since at least 2012. And I'm going to talk more in a future session about the story of how we got our overture and how that came about. But today we're just going to talk a little bit about the overture itself. So the overture, which is, there's a link down here that maybe Carol or Christina can put into the chat, is Overture 0812 on support for carbon pricing. And it expressed its profound concern about the destructive effects of climate change on all God's creation, including a disproportionate impact on those living in poverty and in the least developed countries. It recognized the gospel's call and moral mandate for humanity to shift to a sustainable energy regimes in ways that are both just and compassionate. And it said we should work with citizens, voters, legislators, and others, decision makers, and other organizations that have parallel goals, like Citizens Climate Lobby, to bring into effect national and international policies that create consistent, rational, and escalating price for emissions of CO2. And very important, we need to protect the poor by advocating policies that implement emissions pricing and offset the regressive nature of the pricing mechanisms with mechanisms such as per capita rebates. And we'll talk more about all those economic details down the road here. So why do we want to have carbon pricing? Because that is the most efficient method of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And it's a carbon tax is one method of carbon pricing that's more efficient than cap and trade. And it's also much less susceptible to manipulation and unintended consequences. And we'll talk more about the economics next week or in 2 weeks' time. But the specific proposal that we're talking about is called Carbon Fee and Dividend, and it was developed by Citizens Climate Lobby. And we'll talk about the details and consequences next week, but in summary, it is a fee paid by oil and gas and coal producers where the fossil fuels enter the economy, and it starts out at a relatively low $15 per ton of CO2 emitted when it's burned. And that goes up every year at $10 per ton of CO2. So in terms of your pocketbook, that's about an additional 15 cents on a gallon of gasoline the first year, about an additional $1 after a decade, and about $2 additional after 2 decades. And so that will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. and then the dividend is returning 100% of that to the population in monthly dividend checks, per capita dividend checks. So now we move on to the science section and talk about what the issue is, what the problem is. And the Earth has a naturally occurring greenhouse gas effect. And the sun rays come through the atmosphere, basically unimpeded, heat up the Earth. The Earth radiates heat at different wavelengths, and most of that heat is trapped by the same greenhouse gases that were basically transparent to the incoming sunlight. And this effect has been known for centuries. Back in 1820s, Joseph Fourier, a French mathematician, calculated that the world would be 60 degrees Fahrenheit colder if we didn't have this naturally occurring greenhouse gas effect. So we need it. We never would have developed, mankind never would have developed as we have without this. We'd be a frozen rock. But the problem is we've increased our greenhouse gases significantly. Carbon dioxide over 50% and methane over 100%. So this is a chart showing that effect, the greenhouse gas effect, with transmission of both sunlight and our radiated heat through the atmosphere. And it's versus wavelength, the radiation wavelength down here. So we have the visible section in the middle of the sunlight energy. And then most of the heat is infrared. And 70% of the sunlight comes through the atmosphere, but when it's radiated, that's only 20% that escapes into space, because the rest is blocked by these greenhouse gases. And we see the different gases down here on the bottom. And so we've increased CO2 and methane and the other greenhouse gases with our mankind's activities. But one of the consequences of that is, with the increasing temperature of the atmosphere, we've also increased the amount of H2O. So that's water vapor. So that's a feedback mechanism that makes the effect more pronounced. And that leads to rising temperatures. This is over the course of the last century. This is temperature and carbon dioxide on the bottom scale over the past 6,000 years, basically the development of human civilization. And we've been blessed with relatively moderate temperatures. And our agriculture, that's allowed agriculture, and that's based on that. And more recently, all our engineering codes and all our development has been based on this relatively stable temperature profile. But as you see, we're changing that significantly with our greenhouse gas emissions. And this is a look, again, carbon dioxide on top and temperature on the bottom over almost 1 million years, showing the glacial periods and the higher interglacial periods. And these cycles are due to the attitude of the Earth relative to the sun. And these, according to the natural cycles, we were at the peak and we were going to be dropping into another ice age, but we've changed that significantly. So that's sort of the atmospheric science part of the talk. Are there any questions at this point? Okay. A lot of folks, now we're going to talk a little bit about perceptions of climate change and the issue. And a lot of people think that the scientific community is split sort of 50-50 because they remember seeing two people on TV, two talking heads, debating the issue. But in fact, 97% of atmospheric scientists know that it's real, it's us, there's consensus, and it's bad, but there are solutions. And when you talk to atmospheric scientists about this, they say, this isn't important. The fact that the majority of atmospheric scientists think one thing or the other isn't important, but the number of peer-reviewed papers, that's what's important. That's the way our scientific community moves forward and establishes what the best thinking is, and then science builds on that and moves forward more. And they've done studies of the peer-reviewed papers, and some studies conclude 97, some 99.9% of these papers support the consensus. And they've looked at the outliers that don't support that, and they found, one study found that for every paper they looked at that didn't support the consensus, when they found errors in data or errors in analysis, and when they corrected those errors, they came back to say, it's real, it's us, we need to act. Some folks say that, well, academic atmospheric scientists need to make this a bigger issue because it will improve their funding. And I don't think that's in general the case. It's possible it happens in isolated incidents here and there. But there are two other sections of society that we can look to that are raising the alarm that we need to address this, and they don't have any benefit from it. And one is the defense community. This is a picture of Admiral David Titley. He's on the advisory board of Citizens Climate Lobby. And he likes to ask a group like this, do you believe in climate change? Everybody raises their hand. He says, I don't. He says, I believe in God, but this shouldn't be about belief. This should be about science and looking at the science and what does that tell us? And the overwhelming weight of scientific evidence says this is a problem. And he is not at all alone in the defense community. There are many leaders and retired leaders who are raising the alarm that we need to take action on this. Another segment of our society that we might want to listen to on this is my industry, the oil and gas majors. This cartoon is from the Houston Chronicle when a group of Exxon executives came down from Fort Worth and told the Chronicle why they know climate change is real, the risk is real, and the government should take action. This was printed during the Paris climate talks. And it's not just Exxon, it's almost all the oil and gas supermajors who support carbon pricing. And these companies are some of the most technology savvy, earth science based companies in the world. And for them to support carbon pricing, which is raising the cost of their main products so they sell less of it, they have to be very convinced of the science and of the economics that this is what we need to do. This is ExxonMobil's corporate website showing their support for revenue neutral carbon tax, as they've had up for over a decade. This is a chart from a report published in 1982 that was shared with Congress at that point, talking about atmospheric CO2, and on the left curve is atmospheric CO2, and from 1980s they predicted it to go up to 420 parts per million, which is pretty close, and they predicted the temperature to go up about 1 degree Celsius, which is also pretty close to what we have now. So this basic science has been, it isn't new, it's been around, and Congress and leadership have been aware of it, but we haven't been acting on it. So the international community's response has been to develop the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which brings together the best scientists from all over the world to help consolidate the position and what the issue is scientifically. And this group has a range of experts. It includes scientists from environmental groups. It includes scientists from industry, including ExxonMobil. They've been a member since it started in 1988. And they've issued periodic reports, and each report has increased the urgency of its alarm. And the last report was by far the most urgent, saying we really needed to take serious action to reduce our emissions in 12 years. And this report also spent a fair amount of effort talking about what 2 degrees at the end of the century and 1.5 degrees at the end of the century was going to look like, and how the 2 degree scenario was so much worse than the 1.5. So if we can get to 1.5, that would be a far better world to live in for future generations than the 2 degrees. But we really need to start acting to be within that range. And we need to cut our emissions by 50% within 12 years was their conclusion. So are there any questions on those sections? So Christina.
All right, thank you very much, Bill. Let's look at Indiana now. You know, you've probably heard people say, well, what's the difference, 1 or 2 degrees increase in temperature? And when I first saw this particular slide a couple of years ago, I really got the idea of what's at stake in a very clear way. So these are based on average summer temperatures. And if you look at the Indiana outlined in black, that's where we've been for the past couple decades. Let's take a trip on down south now, cruise on down to the 2 red outlines. If we continue business as normal, by the 2050s, you can see our climate will be similar to Arkansas's, and by the 2080s, similar to the coast of Texas. That's if we continue with our high emissions, if we continue business as usual. But our actions can make a difference. So if you look at the green outlines, yes, the climate has changed there as well, but not as drastically. And that's because if we do cut back emissions, we can make a difference. This is based on moderate cutbacks. It was some research done by Purdue University's Climate Change Impacts Assessment. And I don't recall right now how they defined moderate, but the point is we can make a difference, and with perhaps more aggressive emissions reductions, we would even be a little bit closer to where we are right now. Now, some people might say, well, but we can't afford to make the needed changes to prevent this climate change from happening. So we'll just have to adapt to having Indiana have a climate similar to Arkansas or Texas. And sometimes people add, well, I like hot weather better anyway. But when we look at the next slide, we'll see that we cannot afford to continue business as usual. Again, this is from the Indiana Climate Impacts Assessment. And if you take a moment just to look at it yourself, you'll see that there's probably all of you can relate to some of these in some way personally or people in your community. It affects almost every aspect of our lives. And for example, let's look at decreased productivity of corn and soybean crops. Again, you could say, well, let's just adapt. You know, our scientists can come up with new crops. We can come up with new ways of managing our agricultural system. But the cost of that and the timeline we need to get it done quickly enough are just absolutely staggering. Another example that many of you probably have firsthand experience with is increased heavy rainfall. And we know so many communities across Indiana are really struggling now with the cost of trying to repair existing infrastructure and trying to build more resilient infrastructure for the future. So there are just so many ways in which our own communities will be affected. You know, it's not just polar bears up north. It's not just small island nations out in the Pacific. Indiana itself is being and will be affected by climate change. Let's dig a little bit deeper. Let's look just at the heat issue and the extreme flooding issue, county by county. Indiana University has what's called the Environmental Resilience Institute, and it's a consortium. It's a consortium actually of a whole bunch of scientists from across the states at all of our major universities who are working on research. And they've broken things down by county. So we can actually go to Floyd County and look up, in this case, extreme heat. We could look up the other problems too, but in this case, we'll look at extreme heat. And you can see there's going to be quite a difference. Currently, we're about 29 days per year above 90 degrees, and it's projected to be 79 to 93 days above 90 degrees by the 2050s if we don't take action. And this is not just an issue of, oh gosh, we're uncomfortable when it's hot. It is a severe health issue. The Center for Disease Control considers heat stroke to be a major threat of climate change. And those who are most vulnerable are children, the elderly, lower income people, people with pre-existing conditions such as asthma, heart disease, and so on. So it's an environmental justice, a social justice issue. It's really going to affect us if we don't do something. Let's head on over to Scott County now. And on the next slide, we will look at precipitation. And again, this data is available for every county in Indiana on the Environmental Resilience Institute website, and I'll share that link with you. Anyway, so we see that right now we have about 19 extreme precipitation events per decade. As a matter of fact, Bloomington just had one last night. But the increase is going to be significant by the 2050s if we don't do something. If we look at that first bullet point, this one is an example of how our changing patterns can affect so many aspects of our lives. For example, the precipitation is expected to actually increase in winter and spring, but then decrease in the summer and fall with an overall increase, but lots in winter and spring, much less than usual in summer and fall. And those of you involved with agriculture know that's just a recipe for disaster, because when there's all those heavy rain in the spring, farmers can't get in to plant their crops. And then during the summer, when they most need the water, it's going to be hot and less water. The second bullet point, we can see that Scott County already has an average of 8.1 inches more of rain and snow over the course of the year now, and that's going to increase. So that's just a little quick snapshot of what's at stake here in Indiana. And my purpose is not to create a sense of doom and gloom, but rather to say we can solve this problem. This is an offer, it's a call for stewardship action and environmental justice for those who are going to be most affected by these changes that we see happening.
All right. So we've got just a few minutes. We promised to be finished by 5:45, so we've got a couple minutes for discussion and questions. If anybody has a question, does anybody have a particular aha moment or a takeaway that they want to share? Let's see, do we need to unmute people? Christina?
Yeah.
Okay. And how about our viewing option? There we go.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, I'm going to start with a takeaway. I mean, a lot of the stuff that Bill's covered, I had heard before, but oh my goodness, the information about Scott County in the 2050s about we are. I mean, we did have I don't know if it was extreme, but it was a pretty bad rain event 2 days ago. So, you know, if we're going from 19 of those now, which is a lot, to 26 to 27, that's kind of scary. So I did not realize that. So that's, you know, I have friends who live in low areas that won't be glad about that. I know. Anybody else have any takeaways or ahas?
Well, Carol, it's good to be, I guess, good to be reminded of this, not comforting, but good. With, you know, climate change been kind of pushed out of the news cycle right now, but
Yes,
it's still there and still happening. And I appreciate the reminder of what a big issue it is and how important.
Yeah, I think that what we've seen with the coronavirus is what actually can happen in a fairly short amount of time, at least in terms of air quality. I mean, it's too short a time to see temperature changes, but in terms of air quality, we've seen amazing things happen in a very short amount of time, which should remind us that, hey, you know what? We're making a pretty big impact here, and we can make an even bigger impact if we are intentional about it. So in some ways, it's been very, it's generated some hope to be able to see that. Anybody else, any questions for Bill or for Christina?
No questions, but it tells us that there's more need for our trees. And once a large tree is cut down, and if it is replaced, it's replaced with something about an inch across. It will take forever for that tree to be large enough to have the impact that the large tree that was cut down had. So it's up to our trees. We have to protect them.
Yeah, absolutely. And plant more. Yeah, exactly.
This is Michael.
Yes.
So my work with Indiana Forest Alliance, and we're starting to partner up with Carbon Neutral Indiana, and we've been in conversations with DNR Forestry, and everyone agrees that climate change is critical, that forests and trees and urban forests play a huge role in mitigation of carbon and GHGs. And the thing we keep running up against is finding a way to measure, kind of what Norma was just saying, and Bill could speak to this, but measuring the effect. Like he mentioned, I heard and helped me understand that you mentioned that the fee and dividends, you said $15 per ton of CO2 burned. So now is that what we want to, as a measure and a dollar figure, any company that manufactures, does anything, that we will calculate that they create X amount of tons and they got to pay the $15 for each ton. If that's true, I find that helpful. Norma, I got some news from the National Forest Foundation, and this is the closest I've gotten yet. They say one tree will mitigate half a ton of carbon in its lifetime. So that's the first time I've heard any kind of quantified measurement. One tree can take care of half a ton of carbon in 100 years. So then now we can start talking about, well, what happens if you cut 1,000 acres? But am I right there, Bill? I'm trying to understand that the $15 per ton burned, that's what you're shooting for to try as a fee, and then dividend. Is the whole $15 returned to people, or is there something else that happens with the portion of that $15 per ton?
Right. Our proposal starts at $15 a ton and then goes up $10 a ton every year. So it starts at a relatively low level, but keeps increasing. And then we return 100% of the net revenue collected. So there's some cost for collection and distribution. But after that, we return 100% of it to the population in monthly dividend checks.
And so this $15 per ton is assessed on industry and business and manufacture, or what about household? Like, I just looked at Carbon Neutral Indiana, and according to their calculations of my lifestyle, I've got a green footprint, and I even with recycling and conscientious efforts, I'm still contributing CO2 by my lifestyle. I got to pay $15 too?
No, you're going to pay a little bit more for all products that contain fossil fuel energy. So the companies that produce the fuel pay for the fee, but then that's going to increase the cost of the fuel down the road. So it's going to increase the cost of gasoline. It's going to increase the cost of electricity that's produced by fossil fuels. Electricity produced by solar won't go up. So
Right.
the solar.
So Michael, these are excellent questions.
Okay. Are we out of time? Is that what you're telling me?
We're just about out of time. I did want to reassure you, when our next session on the 26th is going to go deeply into carbon fee and dividend. So the questions that you're asking about how does that work, we're going to be talking about in depth in 2 weeks. So keep thinking about that, come up with more questions, because hopefully we can get those answered 2 weeks from now. Okay?
I'd like to ask if it's okay with everyone that's on, all of us participants, can Carol send us an email with everybody's name and contact information? I'd love to be able to communicate with Bill and Christina, like swap some emails back and forth. But I guess I need permission, or want permission, or you have my permission to share my email with everyone in the group.
Okay, so what I'll do is, I'm just going to put this out to the group. If you would like your email address shared within the group, let me know that, okay? Just shoot me an email that says, yes, please share my email, and I'll come up with a list of all the people that are interested in sharing. How about that? Does that sound like a plan?
Thank you.
How about knowing if they do texting too?
Say that again?
How about knowing if they do texting? Not everybody does texting.
Oh, texting. Yes, that's okay. All right. Well, so in your text or email, let me know your preferred way of communicating. Okay?
Okay.
And if you want that shared with other people.
And I'd also
thank you for putting it together.
Yep. And I'd also suggest, if you have questions about carbon fee and dividend or Citizens Climate Lobby, Heather is here locally with Citizens Climate Lobby. So if you start asking her the questions, I think that's the best avenue for asking just basic questions on CCL and carbon fee and dividend.
Right. Okay. So it is
Carol,
about,
send
it is,
my email to Heather.
sorry, Michael, I didn't hear.
Ivy,
Send my email to Heather.
Okay, I tell you what, how about, okay, let me promise to do this. Bill has some homework to do before the next session. He's going to be reorganizing his slides into a specific program for us in 2 weeks. Christina and I are going to send a follow-up email with some links. Specifically, one of the links that she shared today, we know people will probably want to get on, the Indiana Environmental Resilience Institute. You'll get that link. We'll also send everybody a link to how to get in touch with both Heather locally and also into the CCL, the Citizens Climate Lobby website, so that you can get on there. There is so much information on there, it's unbelievable. So that if you want more information right now, that's a good place to go. So we'll be doing our homework. You'll hear from us, from Christina and I soon with some follow-up information for you. If you have any questions in the meantime, don't hesitate to either call me. I think most of you all have my phone number now, and you certainly have my email address. As I said, I would like to know who would like to be on a group list for communicating and how you'd like to communicate. So please let me know that. Send me an email about that.
And
And I would invite. Oh, go ahead, Bill.
If you could also send a link to the overture.
right, yeah.
Okay, good idea.
And I'd like to give everybody a piece of homework, and that is to take a look at the overture that Carol sends you. Because we'll be talking more about that and the implementation of that. But it's good for Presbyterians to be aware of that and help start to communicate it.
Great. Okay. All right. Any other information we need to share before we say goodbye?
I'd like to
Say one thing.
Sure, Heather.
Joining the company, and I'm one of the co-leaders of the New Albany group. But I think with this group or a group like it from so many people across Southern Indiana, we could have a big impact on making a difference in climate change in our state and even potentially nationally. So I think this is a big deal. And I think it has the potential to be real for you all.
Great. Thank you, Heather. And you'll have more to say about that, I know, on our third session when we talk about what we can actually do. What kind of action can we take? So, yeah, that's a little preview for coming events, right? Okay. All right. So, all right. Well, why don't we start it in prayer, and let's please close in prayer. So why don't we all pray together? Dear God, we are so grateful for this time together, for learning and for fellowship. Please be with us as we depart, Lord, helping us prayerfully digest what we've learned today so that we can begin to dream together into a new and healthy world. Amen. All right. So you will hear from us, and we will see you all in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you.